Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Miller Center at the University of Virginia. I'm Todd Sechser. I'm a professor in the politics department at UVA and a senior fellow here at the Miller Center. I'm also director of the Democratic Statecraft Lab, which is a project sponsored by the Democracy Initiative that aims to map the foundations of a democratic grand strategy for an era of great power rivalry. Great power rivalry just happens to be the subject of our discussion today, and specifically the emerging rivalry between the United States and China. Even before the coronavirus pandemic, relations between the United States and China were troubled. In his first 3 years as president, Donald Trump launched a trade war with China, tried to cripple Chinese firms like the telecom giant Huawei, and spoke about China as a revisionist power seeking to shape a world antithetical to US values and interests. The coronavirus pandemic seems to have only accelerated this downward trend, as the two sides have been competing lately to shape the narrative about who is responsible for the outbreak of the virus and which country has responded to it more effectively. Today, 6 months after the first virus lockdowns began to be imposed in the United States, we're going to step back and assess how the pandemic has affected the US-China relationship. And our focus is on three big questions. First question, how have the United States and China tried to harness this crisis to their advantage? From a geopolitical perspective, what has been each country's approach, and how have the two countries adjusted their overall foreign policy strategies in response to the pandemic? Second, how effective have these strategies been? And to put it bluntly, which side is coming out ahead in the crisis from a foreign policy perspective? If and when the pandemic eventually recedes, whenever that might be, which country is going to be left in the comparatively stronger position? Some scholars have argued that the pandemic is accelerating the shift in power from West to East, as the Western model of democracy has been tarnished by the slow US response to the pandemic. But others have argued that this pessimism is unwarranted and that the core fundamentals of the global order are unchanged, even despite the pandemic. So today we'll discuss which perspective makes the better case. Third, what are the effects of the pandemic on the overall relationship between the United States and China? The conventional wisdom in Washington for several years has been that we have entered a new period of great power rivalry. Has the pandemic increased the likelihood that this rivalry could escalate into a second Cold War or even a military confrontation? Or has it highlighted the importance of fostering Sino-American cooperation on transnational issues? And what factors should we be watching to determine which direction the rivalry will take? To answer these questions today, we have several terrific panelists. Our first panelist is Kurt Campbell, who's the chairman and chief executive officer of the Asia Group, LLC, and chairman of the board of the Center for a New American Security. From 2009 to 2013, he served as the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian and Pacific Affairs, where he's widely credited as being a key architect of the Obama administration's pivot to Asia. John Owen is a Miller Center Faculty Senior Fellow and the Ambassador Henry J. and Mrs. Marion R. Taylor Professor of Politics here at the University of Virginia. He's the author of several books, including The Clash of Ideas in World Politics and Liberal Peace, Liberal War, American Politics and International Security. Dr. Owen is also a member of the Democratic Statecraft Lab. And Jessica Chen Weiss is a political scientist and associate professor of government at Cornell University. She studies Chinese politics and foreign relations with an emphasis on nationalism and public opinion, focusing on the connection between domestic politics and international relations. Now, before we begin, I want to note for our audience members that we welcome your questions throughout the program. And if you have a question that you'd like to ask the panelists, please use the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your Zoom screen, and we'll get to as many questions as we can. So with that, let's get underway. Each of our panelists will have 10 minutes for remarks, and then we'll move to questions and answers. We'll begin with Dr. Kurt Campbell. Dr. Campbell, welcome.
Thanks, Todd. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's great to be able to support the Miller Center. It's a great institution and really appreciate the opportunity to be with friends on the panel as well. So I'd just like to make three quick points at the outset, if I could. First, I think we do have to underscore, yes, there are enormous, exciting debates about grand strategy, but at the core, we have to recognize this is just an unbelievable human disaster and calamity. And we just can't lose sight of that and recognize also that, for any of us who think about vaccines and the like, I'd love to tell you that the more you know, the less complicated it is. It's the reverse. And it leads me to believe that we're actually really still in the very early innings of this. And it's going to play out for a substantial period of time. And so these debates are important, but there's so much left to play out to be able to make really fundamental judgments around the impact on great power competition. I will say already, though, we've seen several things. It's very clear that the coronavirus has slowed down many things: global growth, globalization, interconnectedness of every kind. But one thing it has clearly accelerated are debates around where the US-China relationship is headed and questions about whether we're embarking into a new Cold War. I do want to just underscore, I think it's clear, at least I think to most of us, that we are at the end of what would be described loosely as a 40-year period of engagement between the United States and China. Although that is hardly a strategy, it's more a philosophy or sort of an overall set of hopes and expectations. But we're at the very earliest stages of trying to think about the way forward. And so these projects and others are important, but I think we have to recognize that it will take years and probably a succession of presidents until we settle on an appropriate approach and strategy with respect to the future of US-China relations. I think we also have to recognize very clearly we have no model of any previous kind of relationship with another big power that in any way resembles the kind of relationship between the United States and China. And our fallback option to think about this as a Cold War in many respects just clearly exemplifies our own limitations strategically. We could talk for 20 minutes now about the differences between the United States and China and the United States and the former Soviet Union. I don't think that's very useful. I think it's pretty clear. Most of your listeners really appreciate it. Yes, there's tension, but the larger issues, geography, ideology, interconnectedness, are extraordinarily different. And so I think a degree of modesty in our reflection, Todd, about the time it's going to take to settle on a way forward. And I think it's also clear that, this is not going to be a set of circumstances where we find easy answers. We're probably going to be in an unstable period in which the best we can hope for is a kind of management. Again, something that the United States has very little experience with overall. The second point I would make is that the coronavirus has also helped us with a larger shift that is underway, and you can call it what you want, a rebalance or pivot or whatever, but the larger recognition that rarely has a great power gone on such a fundamental detour in a way that it is not in its own strategic interests. And if you look back over the last 20 years of American experience in the Middle East, it's really a tragedy. Rarely has a country spent this much time, money, treasure, blood, and sweat, and have so little to show for it. Without question, in the Asia Pacific region, we're still in the early stages of that. I'm grateful to see someone like Jessica on the call. When I see young people like her coming up, it gives great confidence. But generally speaking, I find myself more and more in settings in which the speakers have had 20, 25 years of extraordinary experience in Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria. Now they're bringing their expertise and their record of success to the Asia Pacific region. We're going to have to gear up in understanding history and experience and the fundamentals of how Asia operates. I find myself in conversation with people who say, well, that country, clearly they're with China or they're with the United States, without really understanding that the lines of demarcation do not run along borders in the way that the Cold War was designated. They run, in many respects, through capitals in which every country seeks a kind of balance in its relations between the United States and China. And if at all possible, would like to avoid having to make a fundamental choice as we go forward. So this process of capacity building, both intellectual and capacity to take on great power challenges, requires a different kind of military. It requires different tools of statecraft and overall a different focus. I see some of that underway inside the US government, and it's picking up steam, but it will take time. And the truth is we have profoundly underinvested in almost every capacity of power in the Asia Pacific region. We have a very good strategic position in Asia, but I think over time that position has in many respects been challenged and has not had the appropriate investment, as I've said. The last point, Todd, and then I'll turn it over to you for the next panelists, is at the core of this debate and concern about great power politics is something that I think Americans are either loath to acknowledge or discuss, or it somehow escapes us. If you travel through most of Asia, the biggest question right now is not just whether Xi Jinping and China are shifting the direction of their foreign and security policies in ways that are now deeply antithetical to the maintenance of global order. But really, the fundamental question is whether the United States is up for it going forward. There are deep, profound worries that the United States, largely because of the coronavirus, but also because of social disarray, because of our, torquing our allies, everything. There is a worry that we are experiencing strategic incoherence and profound societal decline, rapid societal decline, and that we're not going to be able, even in the best of circumstances, to play the historical role of upholding the operating system of Asia, which we've done for 70 years. And so those questions are deep and profound, and they will endure. They've been accentuated by the pandemic, but they're going to play out over time. Now, I give myself hope and some confidence by the fact that we faced this before and on several occasions, after Vietnam, after the Cold War, after the global economic crisis, deep concerns about American decline. Each time we've been able to claw back and prove the naysayers wrong, demonstrating our ability to recreate ourselves, to reinvent ourselves, to launch new capabilities more generally. The question is, will we be able to do it this time around? Thank you, Todd.
Terrific. Thank you, Kurt, for your excellent remarks. I want to remind the audience of the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You don't have to wait until the end. Throughout the program, feel free to submit your questions through that box. Next, we have Dr. John Owen from the University of Virginia.
Good. Thanks, Todd. Thanks, Kurt, for those remarks. It's really great to be on this call, and I look forward to hearing what Jessica has to say and just to having a conversation, to hear your questions. We're talking about how the pandemic has affected Sino-American competition, and there's much to talk about. For one thing, the pandemic has intensified this great power competition. It was already worsening before COVID-19. It's still not a Cold War, I say, but it's moving that direction, as Kurt already has said. Some opportunities for cooperation between China and the United States for mutual good, really for the global good, have been squandered during the pandemic, unfortunately. The pandemic has also provided opportunities for both China and the United States to reposition themselves to their own advantage. And China, after some early severe missteps, has recovered and really taken advantage of the pandemic to position itself as a benevolent global actor, while the United States seems to be flailing. I'm not going to talk about these things directly, important as they are. I'm going to talk about the international consequences of China's stronger, more successful domestic response to COVID-19 thus far. And I'm going to talk about how this has enhanced the credibility of China's model of domestic governance and weakened, at least for now, the credibility of liberal democracy in the 21st century. I'm going to talk about the consequences for foreign policy for this. The effects of this may be temporary, but they're potentially serious for America's global influence. The virus originated in China, and China, especially Hubei province, had a serious outbreak and many deaths in early 2020, but it got the virus under control in March, while the United States has struggled since March, and fears of a difficult fall and winter are real. Thus far in September, the United States has averaged around 35,000 new cases each day. In China, the figure is around 10, 35,000 versus 10. And just yesterday, the Pew Research Center released results from a multinational survey showing that in 13 democracies, nearly all US allies, America's reputation has suffered from its response to the pandemic. The average across the 13 democracies was 15% say the US has done fine, 37% say China has done fine. These reputations for competence, for meeting tough challenges, are important in international competition. They're important for what we can call the competition behind the competition, between the two models of government or regime types that are competing. So I'm going to talk about a couple of things. First, why we talk about models, the China model, the US model. And second, I'm going to talk about how these things matter. So first, why are we concerned with models or domestic regime types in international politics? I think most people have some notion of this, but I want to make it explicit. Sino-US competition is not just about two big nation states and which one would win in a future war, God forbid, or which country will dominate the global economy or be the main sponsor of global order 10, 20 years from now. It's also about what will determine those things. What's going to cause China or the United States to be more dominant other than luck? And we have good reason to think that the way countries organize themselves internally, their basic institutions, has some bearing on that question. So we can draw on useful analogies from the world of business. So when two car manufacturers compete and one uses more high-tech manufacturing techniques, robots, and the other uses low-tech, we have a competition not just between the two companies, but between the models that they employ and exemplify. With good reason, we believe the models help determine which company does better. Models matter not only because they help cause success or failure, but because they're portable, transferable to other firms, so that if early adoption of robots helped Honda beat its competition, it can help your car company too. That's what makes competition so significant to observers. Now, in the Sino-US case, we're concerned not only with how models of government handle everyday challenges, but now novel challenges like the coronavirus. How well these models anticipate, deter, meet, and learn from these challenges. And epidemiologists are saying that there are probably going to be more such viruses in the future. Now, what exactly the American model and the China model are is actually more complicated than meets the eye, but for purposes of discussion, let me just use the standard labels. The United States is a liberal democracy, a marriage of majority rule with individual rights, which holds regular competitive elections. China is a centralized single-party state, allows much private economic enterprise. These are rough and ready definitions that people outside of academia use. China has been christened by Nicholas Kristof, the New York Times columnist, as a market Leninist. Since I'm speaking to you from Canada, by the way, I need to point out that the American model is not the only model of democracy. Other democracies, including Canada, but also Japan, South Korea, and Germany, have handled the pandemic much better so far. But the fact is that, fairly or not, in much of the world, the United States, being so big, influential, and historically symbolic, exemplifies liberal democracy. So my second point, why does this matter, this competition between governing models or regime types? Is it just about bragging rights, or so we can feel better about our country? What's at stake here? Well, I don't think the stakes are apocalyptic. I don't think American democracy is on the verge of collapse because of its clumsy response so far to the pandemic. But I think there are a couple of important effects. And first is that the relative wealth and power of the United States and China are being affected. The relative wealth and power. Economic growth rates aren't everything, but they're a good first cut. And here, so far, the China model does look superior. The International Monetary Fund has forecast the Chinese economy to grow by 1% in 2020. The US economy to shrink by 8%, These forecasts, of course, affect businesses and capital markets decisions. So they're going to have downstream effects and will affect growth in 2021 as well. Now, China has had higher economic growth than the United States for several decades, of course, and China's economy was already on a path to surpass America's in the next decade. But the difference today is in large part because China has contained the coronavirus. And the moment when the curves cross, Chinese and US economies will probably come sooner now. How much sooner, we don't know. Now, in international politics, wealth matters, and relative wealth matters because it gives a country bargaining leverage and allows it to build and maintain a strong military. And leaders in both China and the United States are well aware of this. The Washington Post reports this morning that China has made good progress in building its third aircraft carrier, this one from scratch. The second area is less well understood, the international influence that having a successful model gives you. And this is sometimes called social power or soft power. It's an asset that great powers very badly want because it enables them to get their way without coercion or bribery. Soft power can persuade other countries to want what you want them to want. How does this work? Well, much of it works through networks of elites. In most countries, elites, leaders in government, business, banking, law, journalism, even academia, look around to other countries to see what policies and laws work and which policies and laws don't work. And when it appears a policy works in another country, they were more likely to adopt it in their own country. We have a lot of social science on this so-called policy diffusion. The same goes for regime types or governing models or constitutions. People in government or who want to be in government look around the world for models of government that work, that deliver success, some combination of economic growth, national security, political stability. They also look for failure. And sometimes countries change their regimes because of this information. There are studies that show, for example, that when democracies grow faster than non-democracies, democracy spreads. More countries become democratic. Now, here's the thing. People who like a system of government, say democracy, because it's successful in other countries, not only want their country to be a democracy, they also tend to want their country to have better relations with other democracies, to open their economies to them, to vote with them in the United Nations, to join international institutions with them, to join military alliances with them. And they tend to be wary of such strong ties with non-democracies. We don't completely know why people exhibit this kind of favoritism. It's probably because of psychological bias and also because of a rational calculation. Countries with a successful model are eventually going to win, so I better align with them now. In any case, at the beginning of my remarks, I noted survey results showing the broad consensus that China has handled the pandemic much better than the United States has. And we can expect democracy's reputation is already suffering to some extent, and so is America's influence and soft power. Fewer elites around the world will be compelled to want to maintain close ties to the United States, and the credibility of the China model is going to gain some luster. Final point, because I think I'm out of time, I just want to say for us Americans, I'm sounding a pessimistic note. And I feel very keenly that we have enough pessimism going around already. So let me recall that while the pandemic is nearly all-consuming now, it may well not be 2 years from now. The 1918 flu pandemic was nearly lost to history until COVID-19 revived interest in it. And let me also point out that some models are better at some things and other models are better at other things. It's not that surprising that the US model of democracy, with its emphasis on individual liberty and decentralization, is going to have trouble mounting a concerted response to a pandemic compared to China. But the US model of liberal democracy has advantages in other areas, including technological innovation. So if the United States were to come up with good and cheap tests, vaccines, and treatments for COVID-19, 6 months to a year from now, the conversation we're having might look very different. And that could restore the credibility of democracy. Thanks.
Thank you, John. Next, we'll go to Dr. Jessica Weiss from Cornell University. Great to have you.
Thanks so much for having me, and a real privilege to join such illustrious and insightful commentators on this panel. I'm delighted to see that our Chinese participant too, Zhu Feng, has been able to join the call as well. So I want to talk about China's response, and I want to second the point that Professor Owen made just now, that domestic performance is really going to be what matters here. We may still be in the early days of seeing what this means for competition between the United States and China, but ultimately this is going to be what ultimately determines which of the two countries, I think, closes that gap, gets ahead, has the power and the resources, as well as the international appeal to lead globally. So since getting the coronavirus under control, Beijing has really tried to turn this into a public relations opportunity. It has tried to deflect some of that international criticism, as well as domestic criticism about its initial response to the outbreak by boasting domestically and internationally about the superiority of its response, as well as its sort of magnanimous exports of personal protective equipment. At least that's how it's tried to portray its so-called mask diplomacy. But Chinese diplomats have gone beyond that to been very vocal in criticizing the performance of Western countries. And the main objective of this propaganda push has been to build domestic support for the Chinese Communist Party's increasingly authoritarian and personalist rule. Rather than a monolith, the Chinese Communist Party, presides over 1.3 billion people, 31 provinces, and enormous internal diversity, using all the tools at its disposal, coercion, but also persuasion and co-optation to maintain power. And the CCP has been deathly afraid of peaceful evolution and the contagion or diffusion of democracy from outside. Most communist states in the world have collapsed, and the CCP is very afraid of going the way of the others. And so the coronavirus outbreak in Wuhan came as a severe shock, and its initial delays, the government's initial delays in confirming evidence of human-to-human transmission, as well as the silencing of local doctors, really provoked a number of very sharp critiques of Chinese-style authoritarianism, and even calls for Xi Jinping to step down on social media. But the CCP was able to turn this around. Their subsequent success in largely containing the virus, especially as other countries struggled, have really emboldened Chinese nationalists and propagandists to claim the superiority of Chinese efforts and the superiority of the Chinese system to combat the epidemic. And meanwhile, the Chinese Communist Party has ensured that critics of their response have been silenced. And at home, this seems to have worked to restore the domestic support for the government, even as there are isolated pockets of dissent. Although I'll be certainly very curious to see what our Chinese colleague has to say on this front. So one survey from April in China suggested that 81% of respondents said they were satisfied with the government's performance, including information dissemination, as well as daily necessities and protection materials. But if it's been working at home, it has not been playing well abroad. Many countries are deeply skeptical, even quite upset about China's performance during the coronavirus, not least the United States, but Australia as well has called for a formal investigation into the origins of the pandemic. And more broadly, China faces a global backlash for its ongoing repression in Xinjiang of Uyghurs and other ethnic minorities, its crackdown in Hong Kong, its growing pressure on Taiwan, its militarized coercion with India on their disputed border, as well as its continued fortification of claims in the South China Sea. Now, there are signs that Beijing is aware of this growing global discontent. And according to an internal think tank in China, top anti-China sentiment globally is at its highest level since the 1989 crackdown. And so we've seen in the last several weeks some growing signs that the Chinese government is interested in recalibrating. And so even as top diplomats have continued to scold foreign governments, they have also signaled an interest in stabilizing US-China ties, as well as China's ties with countries around the world, including in Europe. And so as we think about how it is the United States ought to pursue a smarter strategy, Kurt mentioned that we are at the very beginnings of envisioning a new framework for thinking about US-China policy. I think these overtures by Beijing are an opportunity for the United States to begin this process of recalibration, to create space to work together on fighting the pandemic, other shared challenges like climate change and non-proliferation, while still pushing back against China's worst behaviors in ways that strengthen rather than undermine US values and institutions. And so as my colleague Ali Wine and I wrote in the New York Times recently, such a strategy entails letting China's statist nationalism bump up against its own natural limitations rather than engaging in tit-for-tat measures of America's own. So what are some key components of such a strategy? Well, first, calibration. The United States must push back against Beijing in ways that Beijing can absorb without being discredited domestically. It can't look passive in the face of apparent provocation. So the United States ought to be more selective and judicious than the Trump administration has been about when and how it conducts high-profile military patrols, say in the South China Sea or through the Taiwan Strait. Because the more an issue resonates with nationalist sensitivities inside China, the more likely foreign threats and actions are to provoke rather than deter Beijing. Now, of course, the Chinese Communist Party has a lot of leeway to shape public opinion through propaganda and repression, and this allows Beijing to reduce the costs of compromise and restraint. But still, popular nationalism is not a totally controlled force. It often provides the spark for international confrontation, with Chinese internet users going global in their efforts to defend China. And once mobilized, this popular nationalism, even if it is state-encouraged, nonetheless creates pressure for the government to talk tough and placate domestic audiences, increasing the costs of restraint. Now, Beijing has played along before, often trying to signal resolve while still being careful to avoid outright confrontation or escalation to a hot war, often engaging in largely symbolic military moves or rhetorical bluster. But this is a tricky balancing act because such gestures might temporarily appease domestic demands for a tough stance, but they could also nurture Chinese nationalism for the long run, encouraging and whetting Chinese nationalist appetites. So in pushing back against China, the United States, I think, really needs to be careful to be honing scalpels rather than brandishing hammers. In particular, the United States should take care not to suggest that US policy seeks regime change in China, because such language simply gives Chinese citizens more reason to rally around Xi Jinping rather than focusing on the variety of domestic challenges like slowing growth, environmental devastation and pollution that his government also has to deal with. In addition, sweeping restrictions on Chinese scholars and students can often look like attacks on the whole of the Chinese people, including those of the Chinese diaspora, many of whom are already naturalized citizens here in the United States. And so there are more proportionate responses, I think, to suspected criminal activity by individual scientists, students, or scholars. And many of these students and scholars contribute a lot to the United States' competitiveness or ability to be competitive in frontier technologies. So ultimately, to wrap up, I think the United States' best response to dissuading Beijing from continuing its increasingly nationalistic and authoritarian approach is to adopt what we call an asymmetric strategy. And this means revitalizing the relationships that have long anchored US diplomacy, particularly in the Asia Pacific, not to contain China, but to shape its calculations, both in the region and around the globe. And this also means, most importantly, I think, adopting policies that strengthen the United States' own performance at home, including the openness and dynamism of American society and our system of scientific and economic innovation, while also reaffirming the US's democratic values and institutions at home. Thanks so much. I'm really looking forward to the rest of the conversation and questions.
Thank you, Jessica. We are fortunate enough actually to have a fourth panelist with us today. Dr. Zhu Feng is Executive Director of the China Center for Collaborative Studies of the South China Sea and a Professor of International Relations at Nanjing University. He specializes in East Asian regional security, power relations, and maritime security in the Asia Pacific. And while we are grateful to all of our panelists for being generous with their time, perhaps you get bonus points for calling in near midnight, your time in China. Thank you very much for being with us, and we're looking forward to your remarks. Oh, you'll need to unmute yourself.
Yeah, thank you, Todd. So it's my bigger pleasure joining you, and I also could have such a chance to share your insights over pandemic and we say some sort of a great power competition. Particularly, I'm very happy to see Dr. Campbell and Jessica and Professor Owen. So we haven't met for long. I will have a couple of points just trying to getting through very quickly. First of all, I see pandemic and its falling relations effects to China is very complicated and even some sort of very controversial. On the one hand, I see, yes, how to respond to the pandemic very effectively and very significantly. Chinese neo-authoritarian system showing some sort of dual age, such we say, implications. On the one hand, the high degree of the power centralization and even very systemic execution of some sort of such orders and the commanders almost at all level guarantee the China's response to the pandemic, combat truly is go very, very pervasively, we say, effective. On the other hand, then we will see it's not some sort of such a relative, cutting edge of China's centralized power control center, the system. Then also contribute to the China's very good performance of the combating the pandemic to the China's some sort of, we say, individualistic Chinese value choosing. Compared to the European people and the American people, when you just being forced to just stuck in home, keeping some sort of lockdown and even social distance, then increasing number of Americans and Europeans just feel totally, intolerable. But Chinese, quite a few Chinese will move that way because some sort of essential elements of individualistic Chinese value is in Chinese character, we say, it's a very popular, the Chinese conviction, we say, 好死不如赖活. It's an English translation is some sort of, we say, a good, dash is always far worse than some sort of a lousy, even just existence, a lousy living long. So then after the pandemic hitting the China, most of Chinese, I think they revising some sort of such a very Chinese characterized some sort of individualistic value. So they prefer to follow up with the government orders and also subsiding to or some sort of lockdown and social distance, commanders. So Chinese people usually moved very, very seriously and in some sort of highly disciplined manner. Then on the other hand, I have to say the pandemic and the Chinese response also very, very strongly and apparently unveil the shortcoming or some sort of almost the big fallout of the Chinese system. For example, just some sort of such a pandemic hitting areas, we see a lot of chilling and miserable, stories. It's not just how the infection just broke up. Then we will see a lot of some sort of deaths and without any some sort of real caring. And even the family members just lost their very important, relatives, but without some sort of a personal engagement to take care of all such things. Then all such a story has been just very, very, very seriously with a lockdown. So then we will see some sort of also real stories happening with the Chinese real life when the Wuhan lockdown and where all the rest of the China was totally just distanced from any mass, gatherings. Then I have to say there will be a lot of real stories now until unknown to the Chinese people. Then on the other hand, if some Chinese, we say such a very conscious, intellectuals just trying to tell the world what is going on with the lockdowns Wuhan, then what's happening? For example, Fang Fang's diary. It's a very well-known Chinese women novelist, want to use the diaries to just have a record what is happening in Wuhan. There's a lot of some sort of miserable stories, very strongly telling the world how bad humanity suffered. But even such a story has been just sealed off. And Fang Fang also suffered a lot of criticism. So then I have to say, yes, on the one hand, the Chinese system show it's a big, some sort of a cutting edge to get the things done. But on the other hand, then we will see a very big fallout of the Chinese system is quite a few people know what is really happening just with regard to the humanity, with regard to the respected full life. So then I have to say, even such a contradiction remain extending in today's China. So then on the one hand, we see the government just trying to show how strong we are, just how say very decisively keep the pandemic, spread just under serious control. But on the other hand, we also want to know, for example, what's the economic, we say negative impacts truly now is hitting the China. So then, yeah, I have to say, I'm very sincere. So China's response to the pandemic is very vividly and powerfully revealing and telling the world the two sides of China's story. One side is strong, other side is bad. Then another things I want to share here is, I think how the China just has a reposition ourselves in the pandemic response. On the one hand, I see, yes, Beijing's industrial and the manufacturing capability is highly speed up to produce, for example, the masks and the ventilators and all such medical staffs. So then we would like to contribute to the world. But on the other hand, I also see one of the shortcoming with the Beijing's falling relation is we're less sensible to how particular the world mood and the feeling have been after the pandemic just spread out of all parts of the world. So then we just thought, if we just can donate you the mask and other medical staff, then China deserves a lot of applause, deserve a lot of, we say, such a thanksgiving in return. So my criticism is, yes, Beijing should know the pandemic hit the world really changed a lot of a feeling, of a psyche, of a mood. The people still just stuck in a very terrible and a negative, the mood. We should be more sensible, but actually instead, Beijing's some sort of a high foreign policy profile to seeking for some sort of a Thanksgiving as a return, really just as I say, embarrass the China's positions. It would have been some sort of more appealing, but actually it's also getting more, we say, contradictionary, and even some sort of a negative in the eyes of many peoples. So then I see some sort of a polling survey also very strongly just reveal it's not Americans people see growing, the percentage of unfavorable to the China, but also such as things just how say very quickly and equally happen in ASEAN, in Europe, and even in Africa. So then I see the China's foreign policy with a practitioner in the pandemic heat. The word is really senseless to some sort of such a change the mood, some sort of turning sour the feeling, just because of what? Because of some sort of origination of the pandemic from Wuhan, presumably. Of course, it's a broader shared idea. Yes, we can still keep, some sort of skeptics on where it is really derived of. But the province, it's a broadly shared mood in the world. It's initially came from Wuhan. Last points is, I think China also, I think is less sensitive to some sort of pandemic effects to the Americans' policy of China. Then we will see Trump, President Trump, after Wuhan was locked down, so he tweeted a couple of times, just praising the President Xi Jinping and also praising the China's policy for transparency and resolved. But the problem is, after the middle of March, when the pandemic spread in the US is getting so worse, I think the Trump just trying to return to China with the pandemic retaliation. Because your economy, your pandemic situation is totally getting unbelievably, horrifyingly worse. Then Trump consider it's a China originated pandemic, just to turn over his originally some sort of such a great prospect of the presidential re-election. So then I think the Beijing probably, if we can just take that in mind very earlier, maybe we can just do some sort of a makeup. But unfortunately, China returned, we say, such a wolf warrior diplomacy. It's a refuels some sort of irritation in the White House and even in the United States in general. So conclusively, I see, yes, pandemic is some sort of a new momentous moment, and tasting not just how mature the system is, probably is how fully prepared we could be in responding to some sort of such a unpredicted, the bigger punch. Today, the Trump take China as a punch bag and trying to bring down China almost on all the fronts. So my hunch is Trump launched pandemic retaliation to China is still going on. But the most important to China's expected response is not just a dancing with the Trump's rhythm. We should also stay still and still waiting for some sort of all the things could just finally come down to some sort of even periodical, the conclusion. For example, what will be the outcome of the November 3rd, election, and how American people just could just make your choice, which government will be preferred for your future. So I hope that China now could learn in low profile rather than just still trying to very senselessly slow in the way almost in all the corners. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, thank you so much for calling in to this webinar so late at night. We have a number of questions. And if you have a question, please do use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. One question that has come in has to do with the damage that has been done to the so-called liberal democratic brand, so to speak, by the US response to the pandemic. As several of you have pointed out, the brand has suffered some damage because of the way that the US has responded. But one of our audience members points out that the way that liberal democracies have responded, it varies quite a bit. And some countries like Germany or South Korea have actually responded much more effectively. So maybe John Owen, I'll direct this to you. How much does the response of those other countries mitigate the damage to the Western democratic model or the brand from a global perspective?
Yeah, great question. I mentioned in my talk that Canada, from where I'm speaking, has responded. I mean, I'm in British Columbia. There's almost no coronavirus here. And yeah, I think it's maybe offensive to some citizens of our fellow democracies to think, well, if it doesn't work in America, then the democratic brand is ruined forever around the world. So I don't want to overstate the matter, but if you look historically, the United States is what international relations scholars call a hegemon, a leader, the Greek word for leadership. And so it bears a lot of symbolic weight. As the United States goes, so to some extent, so goes liberal democracy globally, to a greater extent than, say, how Canada goes. And this may not be fair. It's not fair, and yet it is if you look at the broad sweep of international history. So when the Soviet Union began to fail, communism as a brand suffered almost complete collapse. At least the way the Soviets and many other countries did communism, there were people on the Marxist left who said, but this is not fair. You know, real communism has never been tried. Maybe that's the case, but in the real world of politics and perception, it didn't really matter. So the hegemon's version of the regime really is the one that people pay the most attention to.
Todd, can I jump in on this real quickly?
Please go ahead.
Yeah. So look, I appreciate the question. I would say there's a larger thing afoot here. It's not just the liberal democratic order. I think in many respects, we underestimate what the United States and other countries have contributed. Let's call it an operating system. It has many dimensions to it. It has this support for a democratic order, freedom of navigation, peaceful resolution of disputes, support for free trade, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I think it would be fair to say that it's under siege from three sources right now. The first, this is expected, that rising powers always take issue with certain aspects of the existing order. They don't want to reinvent it completely. They just like to reinterpret it in ways that are more favorable to their ultimate position. So they like parts of it, but would like to sort of reconvene and discuss other elements of it. And I think that's to be expected. What's a bit of a surprise is that the biggest challenge comes from the United States, comes from President Trump. Many elements of that approach to global politics are antithetical to what he believes in. Now that's fascinating in the sense that the Republican Party has essentially been the fundamental architect, the Democrats as well, but the Republican Party of this overall approach. And he has so significantly undermined that over time. Trade, alliances, values, you can go on and on and on. And that's important. And then the third thing is, as you've indicated and John discussed, the coronavirus, which has essentially acted as a catalyst in both set of circumstances more generally. And so I don't think we're gonna, I do think there are some countries, we all should move to New Zealand. It looks great down there. I love Australia, I love Canada, but I don't think in the end, the systemic challenge will not be saved by a few case studies, no matter how much we would like to see it.
Just to follow up on that, Kurt, if and when the pandemic subsides, nobody knows when that will be, but presumably it will happen. And under the scenario of a Biden administration, would you expect the pillars supporting globalization to be strengthened and some of these trends to be reversed?
Look, I think a very hard realization for all of us is the most consequential president of the last 30 or 40 years is not Ronald Reagan, is not Bill Clinton. It's probably going to be Donald Trump in ways that are deeply nefarious. And the next few administrations are going to operate under the shadow that is cast by the Trump administration, either 4 or 8 years. And so my hope and belief is that, yes, we will rejoin the WHO. We will try to do what we can on climate change. But I think there is a recognition across the political spectrum, but particularly among Democrats, that there are elements of the way that we had conducted foreign policy and national security, like erosion on a cliff, that we didn't really recognize that elements of that were not as widely understood or supported. Free trade, you can go just down the list. And I think it's going to lead to some caution and wariness in terms of how we proceed forward. My hope is that, we'll understand that this is an enormously consequential period and to seize this moment. But at the same time, I think we're also going to learn that our politics are deeply divided. This election is not going to resolve them. And moving carefully and nimbly is going to be decisive. That does not comport with an environment that welcomes dramatic, bold, expensive international endeavors.
We have just a couple of minutes remaining, so we have time for one more question. I'd like to pose it to all of our panelists. In the Q&A box, we've had several questions about the escalation of tensions between the United States and Russia, or the United States and China, and whether the last several months have simply been a consequence of pre-existing tensions or that have been exposed by the coronavirus, or if the pandemic has actually caused tensions to increase between the US and China. And one of the questions that people are asking is what the United States and China need to do to try to resuscitate the relationship and de-escalate. So I'd like to pose this to everybody. What needs to be done either in this or a next presidential administration to de-escalate the relationship between the United States and China?
To start, if you'd like.
Please, Jessica.
Go ahead.
So I see the driver of tensions as being fundamental. I mean, of course, there were longstanding tensions, but this sudden uptick in tensions and what we're seeing is almost like a free fall or death spiral in US-China relations, I think is being fundamentally driven by domestic factors, somewhat in Beijing, but a large part driven by the upcoming election here in the United States and the Trump administration and Republican strategists' decision to scapegoat China effectively for the catastrophic and incompetent response here at home to the coronavirus. And so there's been a lot more attention to sounding very tough on the Republican side of the aisle than there has been to actually moving forward, I think, US interests, or being very careful in making sure that the punishment actually of China advances US interests. So some of that, I think, will be pulled back after this election cycle, regardless of its outcome. But that's perhaps just a small bit of optimism to leaven my overall pessimism about the tensions that are really here to stay. That said, I think that a Biden administration, for example, would be, as you just heard Kurt Campbell suggest, much more interested in finding targeted, proportionate ways of mitigating the worst sort of excesses of Beijing's behavior, while still making sure that the United States has its sort of priorities straight, and that the sort of the rhetoric and the bluster doesn't overtake what actually ends up being sound strategy.
I would just add, Todd, I like what Jessica said. I would just add one thing, and this may seem counterintuitive, but I actually think one of the proposals that has been put forward is that a key element of China strategy going forward would involve a rather dramatic increase, uptick in strategic dialogue with allies and friends, both in Asia and in Europe. And the United States says that a lot, but if we actually really do it and listen with humility and actually take account and accord of what other countries have to say in Europe and Asia, I think by nature that is going to have a modulating, somewhat moderating effect on American strategy and approach. And so I'm actually quite hopeful about that. I think the previous efforts at diplomacy with China was almost always romantic, bilateral, sitting in the big chairs, the ghost of Henry Kissinger. The primary moving dominant elements of diplomacy are likely to be in the surrounding region and with other interested states. That will make our position stronger, but also we're going to hear stuff that frankly is different than let's proceed full on to a major defining, darkening Cold War that will, blot out the sun for the next 50 years. Thanks.
Zhu Feng or John Owen?
Yeah. I personally, of course, it's a highly debatable question in today's China. So then, for example, so our relations with the United States could be reset, or it could be just remodified. Some people say no, because U.S. is a super national security state. When it's totally just turning around and just sitting around some sort of anti-China load, then it is harder to getting back. But on the other hand, then we will see today's world, for example, it's just not just economically, but socially, just highly interdependentable. So then I don't think, for example, very moderate and the Americans also see, for example, the new Cold War will be some sort of only option left for the both countries. On the other hand, then we will see the Trump administration and its U.S. China hawks really misjudge and even prescribe some sort of key factors to affect both sides. For example, with Mr. Pompeo also call on unity of a free world against the communist China. It's some sort of partially announced, falling of the new Cold War. But I don't think the regional members in East Asia will take it for granted. So then I think Kurt also made a great point. I think we were totally very, very, very impressed. Yes, how the modification could go between the two countries is not just totally through some Washington and Beijing. Then we will see the regional response. Then we'll see other member states, they are some sort of a response. So then I hope, anyway, so first of all, we need to keep the fast for some sort of expectable, prolonged, peace coexisting, while also just competing such a great power relations between Beijing and Washington. Second, I also will say China is still at the transitional period. I also hope the United States will not lose your attraction to redirect China to some sort of a democratic, rule-based, order, such a oriented, the transformation. So then that will be some sort of a real win-win options for both sides.
If I have time, this will be very quick. I think the United States, the world, China all need to recognize this is just going to be a difficult relationship. There's so many kind of baked in problems. One is the rise of China is bound to cause kind of structural problems, if you will. The United States is bound to be worried. It's just not because it's America, but because of the power differential. The regime type difference, which I've been talking about, Jessica talked about, is bound to cause frictions. I think what's needed, and this is going to be very general and maybe unhelpful, is movement toward a new grand bargain. And what Kurt said about involving other U.S. allies and other actors in East Asia and elsewhere has got to be a part of it, not just Washington and Beijing sitting down together, but really moving toward a new grand bargain, the shape of which I can't discern at this point, but that's where the conversation needs to be had, and hopefully the two countries and their neighbors will move forward on that.
Well, we're going to be talking about this question for a long, long time, but I think this is a great cut at the problem. Thank you to all of our panelists, especially those calling in from far-flung time zones, for generously giving your time and your thoughts to us. Thank you to our audience for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you at the next event at the Miller Center. Have a great afternoon.
Thanks all.
Yeah, thanks. Great to see everybody.
Thanks, everybody. That was really terrific.
Thank you.
Thank you, Todd. All the best.
Thank you, Todd. Yeah.
Thanks, Todd. Thanks, Zhu Feng. Good to see you.
Thank you. Good to see you.
All right.